We've got three brilliant speakers who I will introduce and then invite to come forward. Firstly, we have Catherine Liu, who is the author of Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class, which was published in 2021. I'm particularly delighted to have Catherine because I've spoken with her before and I also reviewed the book. And it's probably the most positive book review I have ever published. So I'm absolutely delighted to have Catherine here today. We are also joined by Gabe Winant, an assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago and the author of The Next Shift, The Fall of Industry and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America. Gabe's articles have appeared in publications such as Dissent, N+1 and The Nation. Finally, delighted to be joined by Peter Ramand, author with myself of Yes, the Radical Case for Scottish Independence, in what seems like a long time ago, quite frankly, and also co-editor of a collection of writings by the great nationalist theorist Tom Nairn. Pete's doctoral research centres on themes of populism and nationalism using quantitative class analysis in the Marxist tradition. So three absolutely brilliant speakers coming for you today, after which, as Adrian said, we'll have roughly 50 minutes for Q&A and for back and forth on these various themes related to this growing issue of the power of the professional managerial class, which is becoming an increasingly central debate strategically for the political left today. Firstly, we're going to have Catherine. So if you don't mind coming forward, Catherine.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and to the University of Wisconsin, Pete and James. Good luck with replacing Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland. So I am working on a paper that I'm going to talk through very informally, but I wanted to give you a little background into why I embarked on this topic, because I had at some point, made arguments in various places about how the professional managerial class are the courtiers in the court of capital, or courtiers to capitalists. And this draws on my training in the 17th and 18th century, actually looking at what courtiers in court society was like. But now I with the publication of Charlie Eaton's Bankers in the Ivory Tower and Peter Goodman's Davos Man, I actually have concrete examples of how hedge funds, private equity worked with universities and prestigious universities to actually produce this new form of hoarding I'll call endowment hoarding. And actually, I'm not the person who invented that. It's an economist from Santa Cruz named George Bullman, who has done a lot of research into what university endowments actually are doing. But Charlie Eaton gives us the historical context for that. So I wanted to place into sort of concrete examples about what the new court society might be, how the PMC really are the sycophants and courtiers to capital, and how they hope in a way to ascend through activities within the university itself, American universities, especially. I think in the UK and Scotland, it's really only the most prestigious or the wealthiest universities that have any kind of endowment at all, but they're imitating America now. The other thing that I wanted to say as background to what, this talk I'm going to go through pretty quickly, and James is going to stop me when I go over time, is the large sums of money that were looking for profit in the 1980s were probably stripped out of deindustrialization. So there's a lot of money, as we all know, as good Marxists, that's looking to increase the rate of profit because of the falling rate of profit within investment in industrial capitalism. and the 70s creates a situation of stagflation. I won't go into all the details of this, but there is surplus capital that is floating around by the 1980s because of Ronald Reagan's tax breaks, also because the capitalist class took profits already out of downsizing, deindustrialization, and also already offshoring industrial jobs. So I wanted to give background to that and to talk about how post-industrialism actually works with the factories that produce the professional managerial class, universities, especially elite universities, and the consequences thereof. So that's my way of introduction. And then I'm going to just talk through this paper very, very quickly. So universities have been getting into real estate recently, and most of you probably have heard that the University of California has made a $4 billion investment in Blackstone's Real Estate Income Trust. Blackstone's Real Estate Income Trust has actually been flagged by the United Nations for human rights violations, since Blackstone, the BREIT, goes out and buys distressed properties. It started to do this in the United States, especially in lower income and African American communities. They buy first closed properties, do superficial renovations, and then rent them back to the former owners at a punishing price, drive out those owners and bring in people who can pay more money. Blackstone BREIT is actually doing this in Sweden, in former Czech Republic, with distressed social housing. So so that was a big move that the University of California Pension and Endowment Fund made in January. But the getting into bed with real estate and huge real estate holdings is something that people are doing all over the United States by creating these innovation neighborhoods around universities that are public-private partnerships, from ASU to the University of Washington to UT Austin to University of St. Louis and Washington University, where there's a really distressed or deindustrialized neighborhood. The universities are creating these laboratories and incubators that subtend their properties. So this is a way for universities to participate in in speculation without, actually putting it on their board, putting it on their budgets. But this kind of speculative behavior, how does it begin? Where does it begin? And Charlie Eaton's book names a moment, I think, in the late 80s, when at the Harvard-Yale football game, when Tom Steyer, the guy who ran for president, billionaire, heard that David Swensen, the manager of Yale's endowment fund, was looking for more risky investments for the endowment, because endowments used to be sort of dowager-like vehicles for investment that were happy to make 5% a year. Swensen took Yale's money and said, we can do a lot more with hundreds of millions of dollars. Today it's billions, but at that point it's only hundreds of millions. And Swensen was convinced and courted by Steyer. And 2 years later, he made a $300 million investment in Steyer's Farallon Capital. Farallon Capital is what made Tom Steyer a billionaire. And so it was partially because Yale had made this attractive investment in his fund that other investors began to invest in his fund. And hedge funds and private equity, as you know, one of the things they do is they take over distressed companies, they strip them of their assets and they resell them, or they take over distressed companies and they try to streamline them, make them more efficient. That's the way that they would like to think about this. And right now, private equity is not only moving into distressed real estate, as we saw with Blackstone's BREIT, but all the urgent care little things that are popping up in mini malls all over California, they're funded by private equity because there's a collapse in healthcare, as we all know, in the United States. So they're moving into that. They moved into veterinary care because everyone loved their pets to death during the pandemic. And there's and there's a whole like economy of the vet that I could go into, but they look at places where there's a private public partnership ability to extract profit. And at this point, after the 2008 financial crisis, it certainly looked like real estate was one of those beaten down assets that they could make a lot of money from. And Blackstone was at the cutting edge of this. Fairlawn Capital did more conventional stuff in the 80s, 90s. And Swensen was set a new tone for what endowments could do. By when he first took over Yale's endowment, it was $1.3 billion in 1985. It became $31.2 billion in 2020. When he retired today, it's over $40 billion. And Yale's endowment management techniques became known as the Yale model, and other universities followed suit. So this new drive to increase the rate of return on endowment investment turned into an arms race among top universities. And thanks to a booming stock market during the 2021 fiscal year, university endowments grew by an average of 35%. So one of the things that we could say is, what's wrong with these huge endowments? And point number one is that most endowments are derived from philanthropic contributions, and they are tax write-offs for very, very wealthy people. Strangely enough, because the Republicans really hate universities since they're liberal bastions of liberalism, it was Trump and the Republican Congress that proposed taxing the largest university endowments or large university endowments. They wanted to tax all university endowments, but what they passed through in Congress in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 under Trump was a 1.4% tax on the largest university endowments. That means that it's in $500,000 per student is the cutoff point for the endowments that they were taxed. It only brings in $200 million a year, this of tax revenue. But you can imagine what would happen if endowments were no longer tax-free, or philanthropic institutions, philanthropic contributions could no longer be tax write-offs. The Democratic Party would actually have a cow about that. So they in opposing taxing university endowments, can present themselves as, protectors of higher education. But what actually is happening is they are participating in what economist George Bullman calls endowment hoarding. So how do you fund a university? I'm sorry to go so quickly, but I'm sort of conscious of time. How American universities, public and private, now have to increase their endowments, but they were tuition-driven universities and colleges are seen as very precarious. Public universities, like the one where I teach, and like the University of Wisconsin, were originally funded by public funds, federal funds and state funds. And federal funds increased enormously during the Cold War, during the expansion of the Cold War university, with the GI Bill and the USSR's launch of Sputnik that scared people into thinking we actually need to fund research in the United States. So what happened when Reagan took over, when the 1970s, when he saw what the University of California, which was free at the time when he was governor, was doing with regard to anti-war and free speech movements, he attacked university education first and foremost. And the University of California system, which was funded at its highest rate in the 80s at $25,000 state dollars per student, saw tuition introduced for the first time under Ronald Reagan. The University of California sees itself as an elite university, and I'm going to use it as my example now, and an elite public university, and it began to build up its endowment as state funding decreased. State funding peaked actually in 1985 which is also a peak for humanities majors, in fact. And so with the decrease, but after 1985, we see dramatic decreases in state funding. Every time an economic crisis comes around, state funding is cut and then it's never recovered. Tuition rates go up and they continue to climb. They continue to climb for in-state and public and out-of-state students, to the point where the out-of-state tuition for the University of California is equivalent to a private university what a private university charges. And so you'd think that, okay, so they're building their endowment. The state is not giving us enough money. Like universities, are sitting on piles of money, and this is going to help the operational expenses of universities and help bring down tuition costs. This would be the natural conclusion, is that as UC started building its endowment, or even as Princeton started building its endowment, as Stanford starts building its endowment, this is going to cut tuition because you can spend the rate of return on your endowment for students. In fact, Buhlman's study shows just the opposite happens at this point. University endowments go up, tuition goes up. In fact, Stanford University announced it next year and has a multi-billion-dollar endowment in competing with the Ivies now, about $30 to $40 billion a year. Not a year, in its endowment. Its tuition is going to be the highest tuition, I think, across the United States at $65,000 a year without room and board. So Buhlman finds that endowment income is not used to expand enrollment or increase aid to students in financial need. In fact, Buhlman found that endowment gains were spent on operating expenditures that actually increase the selectivity and national ranking of the school, while spending on student aid was statistically insignificant. So when your alma mater comes asking you for money, and they, Yale asks me for money like every month, what does that money really do? Well, one thing it does is it promotes this idea of a university as a kind of leveraged investment, in which was introduced to the University of California by billionaire Richard Blum, who is the late husband of the Senator Dianne Feinstein. After the 2008 financial crisis, Blum is brought in as a UC regent by the then president of the university, and he introduces Lehman Brothers hasn't fallen yet. And he says, he introduces Lehman Brothers to the UC, and he says, look, guys, Lehman Brothers says, you have an income stream determined, tuition is an incredible income stream. You think you have what potential of $1 billion of debt to finance $1 billion of debt? Your debt limit can go up to $11 billion because people are going to be willing to lend you money because you have a fixed income stream. And that is increasingly what tuition is thought of as a income stream that universities can leverage for more investment. I think I'm reaching the end of my time. Am I reaching the end of my time, James? Am I reaching the end of my? Okay, 5 minutes. Oh yeah, thank you. I was looking at my screen. So, so Richard Blum helps UC by acquiring more debt. Its buildings are bonded now. More bonds are sold, and he also shows, as well as Eaton also shows, that the more a university spends on financing debt, the more its students are actually indebted through student loans. And to wrap up, this article is going to appear in Business Insider behind a paywall, so I'm sort of giving you guys the preview to this, is that it's not the interaction of the networks between Steyer, Blum, Udoff, Swenson is, if you look at all the profiles of these men, they come from sort of middle class, mid-century liberal backgrounds. Their parents are teachers, professionals. In the case of Richard Blum, his parents were shopkeepers. So let's say they come from the petty bourgeoisie. The children go to elite schools. They live the dream of social mobility in the United States in mid-century. They then are promoted to these positions of power in which they interact with capital in a very specific way, and through university investments, through large sums of capital, and acquire a worldview that is the worldview of the capitalist, although they emerge from like the classic petit bourgeoisie of mid-century America. The thing about this is also that, so to conclude very quickly, is that you have a social mobility that works through universities, private equity, to create to make professionals into billionaires, with Blum, with Steyer as my sort of case studies. This point of view, embodied by Peter S. Goodman's book Davos Man, looks at universities as sort of as pure as fields of financial speculation. When you look at what the American university is doing right now, everything it does pleases a capitalist. It pleases a billionaire. If you do something that is marginal to this project, you will not be supported or paid attention to. And that's one of the things about the humanities that is really difficult for a billionaire to imagine. It can be a private public partnership that can be leveraged into making more money. They're building all the time in biotech right now at my university, because people like the former head of, oh God, I've forgotten his name, former head of PIMCO, he wants stem cell research. And then you have all of these other computer science, engineering guys, nanotechnology guys who are getting all of this money because they understand, the capitalist understands that the university can be leveraged into creating, what we call entrepreneurship and innovation zones. So the present day configuration of that conversion model from petit bourgeois to PMC to capitalist within the university is skipping like a whole level of education that I was brought up in, thinking that the university was a place where you could be educated in the good life, or or have like historical, ethical sensibilities. All of that is going away. You know what we have that in at UCI that is getting supported by a bill, from the gaze of the billionaire, is medical humanities. There actually is a discipline for that, but it doesn't sound like it can be leveraged for money. That discipline was called history of science. Also, environmental humanities, extremely friendly to billionaires, because if you look at the things that they want for environmental humanities, it could have been listed from Davos. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop there because I think I've run out of time. Thank you all.
Big round of applause, please, for the excellent Catherine Liu, please. Thank you. Our next speaker, we're equally delighted to have Gabe Winant. Gabe, for those of you who came late, is an assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago. Take it away, Gabe.
Okay. Thanks to Pete and Adrian and James for organizing this, and Catherine for doing this together with me. And especially, I just want to say it's an honor to do this at the Havens Wright Center. I think of Erik Wright in particular as a real kind of like patron saint of the kind of thing that we're interested in talking about here today. And it was someone who, although I never knew him, I looked up to a lot. So I really appreciate the opportunity. So I guess I'll do two things. First, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of theory and concept of the professional managerial class as developed by Barbara and John Ehrenreich. And then I'm really glad that Catherine, and appreciated Catherine's critique of the university, which I agree with wholeheartedly. And I felt like I was actually present in various ways in what you were saying, Catherine, because I did my PhD at Yale. I spent years and years doing kind of antagonistic research on the Yale endowment. People like David Swenson and Tom Steyer were like real household names for me for many years. So I want to kind of then try to use that case in a certain way that we share to think a little bit concretely about some of the questions of class formation that we're here to talk about. So first, just to kind of lay out the concept of the PMC, which I imagine many people here are familiar with. It's been talked about a lot in recent years, but I think it's worth just sort of getting on the table. The concept of the professional managerial class was developed by Barbara and John Ehrenreich in a pair of essays in Radical America in the 1970s. that they wrote in reaction to the disintegration of Students for a Democratic Society at the end of the 1960s and the broader crisis of the New Left, in particular, its inability to turn the kind of student and youth revolution into a wider social transformation, and in particular, the disconnect or disjuncture with traditional working class organizations and militancy. And even to the extent to which the political right was able to counter-mobilize elements of the traditional working class against the student movement in the New Left. That was the kind of intellectual and political problem that they were confronting from the perspective of the mid-1970s. And as they saw it, there were two schools of thought that had developed within the New Left, in particular the white New Left is really what we're talking about, to try to make sense of this. On one side, there was a view that students and young professionals don't really occupy a distinctive class position vis-a-vis the broader working class, that they are simply a kind of new part of a very recognizable phenomenon, and they're not importantly different from it. In particular, the kind of growth of large corporations depending on professional labor makes the student movement a kind of new working class. That was one view. And therefore, there's not really a problem here at all. Another view, which was more characteristic of some kind of Maoist and to some extent Trotskyist formations, was that students and young professionals were essentially petit bourgeois. And that explains, and it had the explanatory power in confronting their political distance from the working class. But it then created a kind of political problem. What do you do with a radical movement rooted in the wrong class, right? And the answer of those elements on the left was to say, well, what members of the New Left ought to do is to kind of transplant themselves, right? To go get jobs in factories and mines and mills, and bring Marxism and Leninism to the actual working class, to sort of efface our own class position. And I mean, quite literally, right? Shave your beard, cut your hair, stop smoking dope, that kind of thing. And the Ehrenreich said each of these positions has something valid, but neither is quite right. And in particular, what they argued instead is that there's a distinctive stratum, which they named the PMC, which arose early in the 20th century with the rise of monopoly capitalism, the large corporation, the kind of collapse of 19th century working class communities, working class kind of forms of artisanal skill and labor processes. As de-skilling, scientific management, and Fordism proceeded through the monopoly capitalist form across the 20th century, it required a new middle layer to basically administer technical and social control in a variety of forms. Teachers, social workers, lawyers, nurses, engineers, even journalists and sort of members of the culture industry in a variety of ways were members of this middle layer that neither ruled society nor was in a straightforward way part of the working class, right? But instead mediated between the two. And politically, what this meant, they thought, was that there is a two-way contradiction that characterizes this class. On one hand, its function is social control, right? And this helps to explain the antagonism between professional middle-class people and working class people, both at the everyday level, right? My social worker is telling me what to do, how to live, and a kind of larger structural and political level, because the sort of reason for existence of this middle class, it was the social control of the working class. On the other hand, members of the PMC were not members of the ruling class, and in particular, their own social reproduction depended on employment, just like it does for the working class. And being dependent on employment in capitalist labor markets, they were subject and remain subject across the 20th century to the forces that working class people are also subject to, in particular, the degradation and de-skilling of their labor, the ways that capital is constantly attempting to decompose, redivide, and ultimately pay less for professional labor. And so that's the second contradiction, right? And the PMC is sort of caught between these two, and this plays out in the individual lives of professionals, as well as kind of structurally and historically across the kind of process of capitalist development and class formation. So their view of the 1960s was that it marked a moment of progress in as much as the radicalization of the PMC had made it possible to see a kind of possibility of alignment between members of the PMC and the working class, and again, members of opposing the PMC to the ruling class. But the lack of understanding of the kind of complexities of this middle position had obstructed such an alignment. So they thought it was a moment of political progress, but one that had ended in defeat. And they wanted to make sense of that episode in order to kind of figure out how to expand further on it. They then, over the course of the rest of the century, Barbara Ehrenreich in particular, kind of stayed on this beat and argued that that defeat had culminated by the 1980s in the kind of emergent phenomenon of sort of what we call yuppies, basically, in which neoliberalism successfully recruited the PMC to its own political coalition, a kind of coalition of finance capital in charge. And this goes to Catherine's discussion, I think, very nicely, with professional middle class kind of people as the junior partner. And that's politically represented by the kind of emerging right wing of the Democratic Party and figures like Gary Hart and Bill Clinton and Michael Dukakis. And it has a real economic basis, right, in the increasing dependence of sectors of the middle class on financial assets of different kinds, most importantly homes, but other forms too. And again, this goes back to the university thing. However, at the same time, their view was that the reason that this was a kind of ultimately bad deal for the PMC because it meant politically kind of assenting to the very same corrosive pressures on professional labor that are always there, and that had been that create the conditions of possibility for PMC radicalism in the first place. If you read Barbara Ehrenreich's wonderful book Fear of Falling, for example, which came out in I think 1989, it has this amazing ending where she begins to describe all of these kind of precarious and corroded forms of professional labor that, for example, she talks about adjunct professors, something that when I got to graduate school in 2010, so what is that, 30 years later, many of my faculty were still denying that such a phenomenon existed. So by the 2010s, in particular by the period after the financial crisis, the kind of seams or the fissures or fault lines between or within that coalition between finance capital and the professional middle class began to widen and to burst, as increasingly the ruling class was only able to make good on its kind of hegemonic promises to its junior partner for a smaller and smaller, a thinner and thinner layer of the PMC, and a larger and larger layer of the PMC was becoming subject to the kind of classic forces of de-skilling, degradation of work, corrosion of career track, it piled up indebtedness, and so on, that were making the kind of possibility of that kind of solid economic middle increasingly a kind of false fantasy or non-possibility for growing proportions of that middle class. There, I will, I guess, leave aside the Ehrenreichs and just sort of insert my own analysis, which is that I think that analysis, that historical background, makes it possible for us to understand better why it is that so much of the socialist and trade unionist energy of the past decade, which I think is on a kind of marked and notable increase in the United States, has come from sectors of the workforce that the Ehrenreichs would clearly describe as the kind of lower strata of the PMC. This includes, I think, the Sanders campaign, not every person in it or every voter for him or anything like that, but a lot of the activist energy. It includes the kind of reawakening sectors of the labor movement. I mean, we're in a moment right now in the United States where graduate student unions are beginning to show real extraordinary kinds of militancy, turning in the 97, 98% yes votes for unions, rejecting contract offers. This just happened to Temple University this week, for example, which would have been unprecedented or would have been very unusual fairly recently. fighting very militant strikes, as happened at the UC system at the end of last year. And I think that phenomenon, we have a hard time both making sense of its conditions of possibility and also of its limits thus far if we don't root it in the kind of dual contradiction that structures the PMC and the way that dual contradiction has developed over time to increasingly separate the lower and upper halves of that middle class from each other. And so, there, I guess I will transition to talking a bit about my own experience of some of the phenomena that Catherine was talking about. I certainly, think it's true that our universities have become, totally voracious and predatory engines of accumulation. And that plays out in innumerable ways, both for the people who are in debt to them, the people who work for them, the people who are their neighbors, the people who are policed by their cops, the people who are, in debt to the hospitals that they operate. I mean, you could go down the list. I suppose what I will say beyond that, I think, and to the topic of class formation, is that those institutions therefore become sites of struggle and sites of class formation. And that was very true in my experience. And I want to talk a bit about Yale, since it's come up and since it's a place that both Catherine and I are connected to, although I don't want to suggest that that very distinct kind of like Death Star of an institution is, representative in any way. But I became interested in the PMC because I was involved in my graduate student union, because I graduated from college in 2008. I was very much in that generation of millennial socialists, right? A very kind of discussed phenomenon, who were who were increasingly radicalized over the period between 2008 and 16 for many, roughly. I got involved in trying to organize graduate student workers at Yale, a project that had been going on for decades, and developing an alliance with the blue collar and pink collar workers unions on campus as sort of one relatively integrated workers organization. And through that project, or through that organizing effort, which, as I say, had been going on for quite some time, since the early 1990s, or late 1980s, we got quite involved in studying the Yale endowment, studying the role of finance capital in the university, the role of real estate speculation in the university. And I was glad to hear the name of David Swenson and Tom Steyer mentioned for this reason, because Tom Steyer actually says that he's talked about in public the ways that the opposition to his firm's investment, in particular in some fossil fuel firms and in private prisons, by the Yale Graduate Student Union, kind of got under his skin and forced him to rethink himself. Now, we don't want to accept what a billionaire says about how he awoke to his conscience or whatever, right? But it's notable when workers' activism and student activism seems to actually, get to a billionaire in some way. And, the campaign against, I just want to note that the campaign against Farallon Capital Management's investments in private prisons was led by Sarah Haley, who is now a professor of history at Columbia University, great scholar of policing and punishment and incarceration in the United States. Similarly, actually, I'm going to share a link in the chat. This is a link to a collection of the research that we did on the investments of the Yale Endowment. And in the top center, you can actually see me in that picture in the foreground in a kind of confrontation with David Swenson, the inventor of the Yale model of financial investment of university endowments. And then if you scroll down the page, you'll see links to various profiles that we constructed of all the incredibly harmful things that endowment was invested in. I say this just to say that the same processes by which the ruling class recruits its junior partner, professional middle class participants in its sort of hegemonic block, right, through the university, through other kinds of nonprofit institutions of various forms, through the Democratic Party. That same process becomes a site of contradiction and of social struggle because of the ways that the ruling class is not able to both pursue its accumulation imperatives and reproduce for the professional middle class in the kind of its own desired forms. It's partly able to do that, right? But it's not totally able to do that. And that then manifests in the form of the contradiction of, for example, graduate students who are angry about the fact that they can't afford their rent, or they can't afford their health care, or they are not going to get the kinds of jobs that they had hoped to get. These are not universal working class experiences exactly, right? They're particular, but they are experiences of a kind of proletarianization in a certain form, as the Ehrenreichs would call it, and as the tradition they come from would call it. And that experience then generates conflict. That conflict generates forms of knowledge about the capitalist class, and that knowledge can potentially be developed into a kind of basis and strategy for working class solidarity and organizing of different kinds. Now, the Ehrenreichs would emphasize, and I would agree, that there are potentially limits here that are important to take seriously, right? That was why they wrote this analysis back in the 1960s, was to understand these limits. It's not straightforward for, let's say, graduate students, sticking with this example, the one close to home for us, to merge themselves politically and culturally and socially with the more traditional working class, right? There are real important differences. There are differences that often take the shape of race, I think most significantly, and also take the shape of the kind of particular forms of exploitation and economic insecurity. And there's no guarantee that those limits and those barriers can be or will be overcome. I think the important question for us to ask about the PMC is it conceivable that they can be overcome? Because given the role of the kind of downwardly mobile and increasingly precarious PMC in generating trade union militancy and socialist militancy in the United States and in the UK, right? This is obviously a significant part of the Corbyn phenomenon. We have to figure out whether it's possible for that militancy to overspill its barriers and connect in some ways with and help to activate wider forms of working class discontent. And, I'm not going to claim that, I know the answer to whether that's possible or not. I think there's lots of evidence on both sides, and that's kind of a complicated question. But it does seem to me like it's a kind of question that requires kind of some amount of political experimentation, particularly at the sites, for example, like universities, also like hospitals, where the kind of lower strata of the PMC come into contact with and have forms of everyday labor process cooperation with more traditional sectors of the working class. And I'll also say, I suppose, that the possibility for such an alignment, which I think is something that we need to be figuring out and exploring the possibility of. The Ehrenreichs always thought that part of it depends on the confrontation of increasingly proletarianized professionals with their own employers, right? So it's not an act of philanthropic charity or something like that. It's not an act of self-sacrificing altruism that professionals have to sort of give their hearts over, right, to the kind of blue-collar working class or something like this. Rather, the point that they made was that since professionals operate the mechanisms of social control of the working class, if they become radicalized and organize themselves in confrontation with their own employers in the court and legal system, in the health system, in the education system, in the research institutions, in the tech industry, if they confront their own employers, then what they will do is break the mechanisms of social control, because they themselves have to operate those mechanisms. And if they become able to refuse to do so on the terms that their employers set, then their employers, that is to say, the ruling class, are going to be unable to maintain the kind of forms of social control that they require to maintain their kind of larger political hegemony. And so this is the kind of logic by which a working class and PMC alignment has potential real power, right? It's not that the PMC gives something to the working class. It's not that it engages in a kind of sympathetic act of philanthropy. It's that its own interest in the kind of meaning and dignity and kind of ethical value of professional work, right? The thing that attracted many of us into it in the first place, the defense of those things, if carried far enough, will actually interfere with the ability of the ruling class to maintain its overall hegemony over society, and therefore will create space for working class self-assertion of a different kind. And ultimately, I think the proper ambition is then the disintegration of the barrier between professional and more traditional working class identities and formations and sectors of society, and ultimately the disintegration of the barrier between mental and manual labor. So my view is that we have to explore whether we can actually capture that possibility, whether the current phenomenon of the militancy of the lower strata of the PMC can successfully break those mechanisms of social control and overspill its barriers. And I hope that we can figure out how to do that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gabe. That was brilliant as well. We are now going to have our third speaker, who is Peter Ramand. He is doing his doctoral research, for those of you who missed the beginning, and the questions related to populism and nationalism, analysed from the perspective of class relations in society. Pete, take it away.
Well, first, I'd like to thank Catherine and Gabe. I really enjoy both of your work on this and other topics, and that was a really great start to the discussion. Today, I'm going to really focus in on the first question in the title of this panel, that is, who are the professional managerial class? Specifically, I'm going to talk about how I think we should define the PMC. To do this, I'm going to return to an old debate called the class boundary problem in mid-20th century sociology. That is, how do we draw the boundary between the working and middle class, and who should fall on one side or the other? The Havens Wright Centre, who organised this event with contours, named after two individuals, Eugene Havens and Erik Olin Wright. And the boundary problem was the conceptual issue that Wright was most famous for engaging with. So today I'm going to bring Erik Olin Wright's work into conversation with the debate on the PMC. In particular, I'm going to try to incorporate Wright's definitional precision on this question in a way that I think could strengthen and expand a Marxist research agenda on the professional managerial class. Now, this might seem a little inside baseball and even perhaps a little bit pernickety. Why worry about the precision of the definition? Is it that important? Well, I think it is. First, there are many arguments made about about what the PMC are like, what they think and what they do. But where these claims aren't compatible with one another, how do we adjudicate between the arguments? We need a way of testing some of the claims that we make. And secondly, there are internal divisions within the PMC. But how should we think about subcategories within it? I don't think the definition developed by Barbara and John Ehrenreich, who first developed the concept, provide quite the adequate tools to do this. This isn't to diminish their work in any way. I think that they are absolutely brilliant. Rather, I see this as a way of building and expanding on their insights. And by formulating a testable class schema, I think we're better able to challenge mainstream approaches to stratification in the social sciences. Around the world, we've clearly seen a breakdown in traditional patterns of support for political parties. It's no longer the case that parties of the centre-left can rely on working class votes. But far from indicating the death of class, as some sociologists and political scientists have argued, I think we're seeing processes of class de-alignment and realignment taking place. And a host of research has come out recently which taps into this phenomenon in different ways. Thomas Piketty, for example, has developed the concept of the Brahmin left. Harnessing impressive data, he demonstrates pretty convincingly that while the left used to be the political arm of the undereducated, it's now become the domain of the educated. This is in no small part due to the left's abandonment of the working classes through its shift towards culturally rather than economically progressive politics. And echoing Christopher Lasch, a famous proponent of the PMC thesis, Piketty also suggests this maps onto a new cleavage of globalists versus nativists. This is something I'll return to later. Similar findings have been documented by Kit Shelton-Rehm and by Dylan Riley, just to name a couple of people. My point here is that whether or not people use the term PMC, research is converging on the notion that left-wing parties are increasingly supported and dominated by something like the professional managerial class. So who are the PMC? In public discussions, I've always felt there's a certain you know it when you see it quality. I think the archetypal member of the PMC that people have in their minds when they think about the PMC is probably the socially liberal university professor. A liberal intellectual who's concerned about issues of oppression and tolerance, who's probably conversant in the language of intersectionality and privilege, but who, when push comes to shove, is pretty disdainful of a deplorable working class who voted for Brexit or Trump. But what's the definition that's been used to delineate the PMC? Well, in the first major essay on the topic, Barbara and John Ehrenreich define the PMC in the following way. The PMC consists of those salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production and whose major functions in the social division of labour may be described broadly as the reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist class relations. So the PMC aren't involved in the direct production of value. They don't make things. Rather, their mental labour is primarily concerned with the social reproduction of capitalism. So who are they exactly? So as well as professors, the occupations that come to mind are lawyers, doctors, corporate executive, tech bros, and so on. But as well as professors and executives, there are a number of other jobs that are primarily concerned with the reproduction of capitalism, which today are commonly thought of as belonging to the working class. For example, which has been mentioned, teachers, nurses, low-paid public sector workers responsible for welfare and benefits, precarious musicians and artists, just to name a few. So the question is, should we classify teachers and nurses in the same class as executives and professors? And for that matter, should college professors be placed in the same category as corporate managers? Do these groups of employees share fundamentally similar material interests? The Ehrenreichs recognize this as a problem, and they address it in the following way. They argue that certain positions within the PMC are closer to the working class than others, while others are closer to the bourgeoisie. A nurse, they say, constitutes a position within the PMC close to the working class. An upper middle manager in a corporation constitutes a position closer to the bourgeoisie. And this brings us to an important point. The Ehrenreichs stress that the PMC is not a homogeneous class. Rather, it's characterized by an internal hierarchy of strata reflecting a range of structural locations. Now, to say that both a registered nurse and an upper middle manager are both members of the same class, albeit at different ends, implies they are closer to one another than they are to any other class. If this wasn't the case, if nurses are actually closer to workers and to upper middle managers, then it wouldn't make sense to see them as being in the same class. Because what is a class if not a group with fundamentally similar interests vis-a-vis capitalism? So a registered nurse and an upper middle manager might have certain commonalities in relation to their social function, but that commonality could not be understood as defining them as within a single coherent class under those circumstances. I'll return to this question with some data a little bit later on. But there is an alternative. Instead of insisting that all positions within the social division of labour fall into firm classes, some positions can be seen as objectively torn between classes. If classes are understood as social relations, not things, this implies that positions have a contradictory character. This is where I want to bring in the work of Erik Olin Wright into the conversation with our discussion of the PMC. Wright became famous for attempting to solve the same problem that concerned the Ehrenreichs, how to define and conceptualize a middle class. He also wanted to operationalize Marx's categories so he could use statistical methods to test and adjudicate between different arguments, hoping that by doing this, Marxists could defeat mainstream sociologists on their home turf. Like the Ehrenreichs, Wright continues to see the fundamental division in society as between capitalists and the working class. But among employees, he makes a distinction along two dimensions. First, your relationship to authority within the production process, and second, your possession of skills and credentials. The first concerns the role of domination. Capitalist production always involves an apparatus of authority involving surveillance, positive and negative sanctions, and varying forms of hierarchy. In these terms, managers can be viewed as exercising delegated capitalist class powers insofar as they engage in practices of domination within production. They're like capitalists in that they dominate workers. They're like workers in that they are controlled by capitalists and exploited within production. Thus, they occupy a contradictory location within class relations. The second axis of differentiation centers on the possession of skills or credentials. In operational terms, this means that your job requires the possession of a degree, postgraduate qualification, or a similar credential, a PhD to become a professor, passing the bar to become a lawyer, getting chartered to become an accountant, and so on. Adding these vectors to the fundamental division created by capitalist property relations generates the following map of the class structure that you can see on the slide. Employees are divided into experts and expert managers, what we might think of as a professional managerial class locations, and non-skilled managers and workers. Wright then expands this class map to add in intermediate locations of supervisors and skilled workers. While there are significant differences in approach between Wright and Ehrenreich, there is also interesting commonalities and overlaps. In particular, both see the middle class as constituting a contradictory position between the capitalist and working class. So what's the payoff of all this? Why am I talking about this? As I've suggested, rather than seeing Wright's analysis as antithetical to that of the Ehrenreichs, I think we could use this definitional operationalization to build on insights in the PMC debate. The Ehrenreich center their definition in terms of the functional reproduction of capitalism, but that's incredibly difficult to operationalize for research purposes, because there are many jobs in, say, engineering, for example, where it's difficult to work out if the job is primarily involved in production or reproduction. But this becomes much easier if we redefine the PMC in relation to structural mechanisms within the class structure, their management positions and advanced degrees, and so on. To be clear, what this definition is saying is that the strategic positions of these individuals within the organization of production enables them to make significant claims on a portion of the social surplus in the form of relatively high earnings. This can be thought of as a kind of rent. The PMC can be defined as the individuals occupying these strategic positions. This makes it far easier to operationalize and allows us to look at how the PMC operate in different places at different times. Here, I've suggested that PMC is a coalition of experts and expert managers alongside skilled managers. So what does a PMC look like in Britain? For the sake of time, I'll skip over the methods I've used, and I'll run through the final section pretty quickly. I'll just say that all of the data comes from the British election study that I'm going to present, and most of what I'll show you comes from the most recent wave, which was collected last year. I use regression analysis, although today I'll just present descriptive findings alongside significance tests. So what does a PMC look like in Britain? There's not really a way to test the efficacy of a class model, but we can see if it conforms to what we might expect. And first of all, here are the percentages of people who said they identified as working class in the UK last year. As you can see, there's very close alignment among experts and expert managers. Next, here's the average annual income in the UK. And we can see that the two highest paid groups are our primary professional managerial class locations, experts and expert managers, who on average earn more than double the wages of non-skilled workers. Although here, as with the previous model, there's closer alignment between experts and expert managers than there is with skilled managers. So if we were to just follow the data rather than theory, perhaps we would confine the PMC to just these expert locations. It's also worth noting that teachers and nurses, who we discussed earlier, almost all of them fall into the skilled worker category. And they are closer to the working class than experts in terms of both average income and in how they think about their class identity. Let's get on to something which I think is particularly interesting, the politics of the PMC. Using this approach, we can also ask about questions related to, for example, class formation. And here I'm presenting some stuff asking, what did the class coalitions that supported Brexit and Scottish independence actually look like? Was it the white working class who voted for Brexit, as some people have suggested? Well, in 2014 and 16, The coalitions in favour of independence and Brexit were not entirely dissimilar. Certainly in both cases, we can see that opposition to Brexit and Scottish independence came primarily from the PMC. And this approach also allows us to see how that's changed over time. Here, we can see how support for independence changed after the Scottish independence referendum. As many of my colleagues at Conter have argued, the movement for Scottish independence became dominated by PMC interests after the referendum. And here we can see evidence of this. While support among the working class more or less flatlined after 2014, in the aftermath of Brexit, support for independence amongst experts and expert managers jumped by 12 to 14 points. I know I'm going pretty fast through these tables, and you're welcome to ask me about any of them, but I'm really just showing you these primarily as an illustration of how, with this altered definition, we can generate some pretty interesting findings about what the PMC looks like and how it's acting in particular contexts. I'll finish with one final table. As I mentioned at the start, Thomas Piketty recently argued that a new cleavage has developed between an increasingly globalist PMC and a nationalist working class. That's my paraphrasing of him. This echoes something Christopher Lasch once wrote in the book Revolt of the Elites, which Conter is running a reading group on right now, in which anyone here is very welcome to join. Just feel free to reach out. Anyway, Lasch made the argument that increasingly the professional managerial class see themselves as world citizens, but without accepting any of the obligations that citizenship in a polity normally implies. He writes that the cosmopolitanism of the favoured few, because it is uninformed by the practice of citizenship, turns out to be a higher form of parochialism. Instead of supporting public services, the professional managerial class put their money into the improvement of their own self-enclosed enclaves. They gladly pay for private and subaltern schools, private police, and private systems of garbage collection. They have managed to relieve themselves to a remarkable extent of the obligation to contribute to the national treasury. Now, I thought this was a really interesting argument, and it chimed with what I think has been happening in Scotland and the UK, particularly if we think about the People's Vote and other campaigns to reverse Brexit. Well, we can partially test it. In the case of both Scotland and the rest of the UK, we see a similar trend. The PMC feel far more European than working class locations. And I can show you additional data that shows that they feel far less attached to their country of birth than to the working class. This points in the same direction as the argument made by Lasch. And I think this new cosmopolitanism needs to be the subject of sustained future research on the PMC. So I apologize if some of this presentation has been disjointed or rushed, but I wanted to provide a sketch of some of the avenues a left research agenda on the PMC could take. Looking at cross-national variation in the PMC and what it looks like, what it thinks, and what it does could provide valuable insights about the dynamics of class politics in the present era. And rather than seeing different theoretical frameworks as opposed, I think it's far more useful to think about how they speak to one another and how a synthesis could benefit both. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pete. That was absolutely brilliant. I'm sure all of those insights from our three speakers has generated a lot of food for thought. If you want to make a contribution, there are two ways that you can do that. You can put your hand up using the facility in Zoom, and I will try to take you in threes. I will ask you to turn off your mic when I do take you. Secondly, you can use the chat facility, and I will read some of the questions out from the chat if that's easier for you. So there are two different ways in which you can participate. Firstly, I'm going to take David Jameson.
Thanks very much, James, and thanks very much to the three speakers. Three really interesting talks, and I think they all complemented each other quite well. I should say, as editor of Conter, if you're interested in the contemporary class politics of Scotland at this particularly interesting moment, do check out conter.scot. But that said, and duty done, I want to ask a question about how attitudes about the middle class have changed throughout the duration of the Marxist tradition. I was very interested that Gabriel said, and I don't know much about the American student movement and American student radicalism, that Trotskyist and Maoist students categorize students as petty bourgeois. And this is a phrase that I've found is widely misused in the history of Marxism and continues to be perhaps to this day. And I'm surprised to the extent that it's supplanted much older Marxist designations for parts of the middle class, particularly brain workers. So, for example, a definition you hear a lot among Marxists in the 20s and 30s, but then disappears from later scholarship, is the intelligentsia. So the concept of the intelligentsia, it seems, itself quite vague, but meaning basically brain workers and people involved in the kind of cultural reproduction of capitalism, disappears and is perhaps readdressed by the concept of the PMC. But what happened to that concept, and is the concept of the PMC superior? The other point I want to make is that, I mean, I happened to reread the Communist Manifesto, it being 175 years since the publication, and I was astonished to find that I'd completely forgotten that Marx discusses the disappearance of the petty bourgeoisie and its replacement by a new class of brain workers in chapter 3 of the Communist Manifesto. So many of the things that are claimed for developments in the class structure of society in the post-war decades seem to me to have been kind of rediscovered repeatedly throughout the history of capitalism. There's a long tradition of saying the middle class is constantly being, in a sense, destroyed or denatured and reproduced anew by capitalism to service its new needs of mediation between the working and capitalist classes, its new needs of the cultural reproduction of the system. So I wanted to ask about, if it seems to me, I'm still kind of unconvinced by the PMC designation because of what Peter just talked about in terms of it contains elements which in a sense have very little in relation to each other. I am convinced of the need for a designation and an examination of the modern middle class. I'm just not sure that the current discussion of the PMC addresses the new class dynamics more than it redescribes the old problem of analyzing the middle class, that there is not a middle class, but multiple middling strata with very different relationships to the system. And surely a focus on perhaps the intelligentsia more closely explains some of the cultural and political phenomena expressed by that. One very last quick point, which is, it seems to me that often those class elements which represent quite a regressive political kind of influence on contemporary events aren't the upper strata, if you like, of the PMC, but they're often people much lower down the scale. And that when we're talking about the problems faced by the left, it's very often the cultural preoccupation specifically of the lower PMC which have come to dominate the left in recent years, with some associated problems. So those are my questions. I'm just going to throw them out to the entire panel. Thanks very much again.
Thanks, David. I'm going to take Jay and then a comment in the chats from Daniel, and then we will give a little bit of time to each of our three speakers. In that time, you will also have the chance, if you wish to do so, to come back on the initial talks as well. If I could then bring forward Jay.
Okay. My question, comment is directed to Gabriel and Catherine. You were basically arguing, especially Gabriel, that with the deepening of the neoliberal agenda, the ability of the ruling class to give material concessions to their PMC collaborators is weakening and create some organizing potential. But I think it's somewhat a little bit more dynamic. For example, if you look at what Adolf Reed calls the BPMC, the Black professional managerial class, they're disproportionately represented in the public sector. And with the privatization, for example, urban schools, the middle management, the leadership has been particularly targeted. So we maybe call them the Keynesian BPMC. But at the same time, the ruling class has been very effective in mobilizing, we could say, the new neoliberal Black BMC with a progressive ideology. When we look at privatizing public schools, this is the civil rights movement of our day, and pouring a lot of money into this sector. So it seems like you're right. On one level, yeah, they weaken one, but then they're underscoring their dynamism. They're able to develop new collaborators at the same time. And then this kind of coincides with Dylan Riley's argument about, as neoliberalism has gone into crisis, they're also developing new ideas, progressive ideas, to kind of legitimate their agenda. And so we see, anti-racism particularly harnessed, in particular when we look at public schools.
Thanks, Jay. I'm going to take a final question from the chat. Please feel free to use the chat for questions, and I'll take some of them. Building from Gabe's comments, could the speakers each talk a little bit about how they've used the PMC concept as a tool in their own political organising? How has it been useful or not in their workplace organising, election campaigns, etc.? That comment is from Daniel Green. I'll take Catherine first. Please feel free, Catherine, also to come back on what Gabe and Pete said, if that's useful as well.
I'm just going to make more general comments, because the questions sort of got a little bit, they were so long that I lost my train of thought. But one of the things that is historically distinctive about the Ehrenreich's definition is that they were really looking at how the college-educated liberals had come to dominate a left progressive movement that had once been dominated by the working class, or even machine politics, ethnic working class, union-driven Democratic Party politics. And that transformation we can document from 1968 onwards as one that has, that culminated in the election of Bill Clinton and then Barack Obama. And so these are people who are, socially mobile, and who use their credentials to not only, add more aura to themselves, but prestige themselves, but to make themselves the avatar of kind of social progress. I don't really understand the idea of using the PMC as an instrument for organizing. I feel like their values and politics, and this is where Gabe and I will completely be differentiated. I feel like the values of the PMC, as they're promulgated today as a function of the division of labor, actually are completely corrosive to any form of organizing or solidarity. I feel like PMC values are the corrosive poison of liberal politics. So you want to use that as a tool. I don't know how to do that. I mean, I will just go out and say this will be recorded, but I think you can see the complete domination of the Democratic Socialist Party, DSA of America, after we had all that utopic hope around Bernie, as being completely corroded by the values of this class. And this class, you can go and define them however you like, as a way of operationally taking over liberal left politics, only promulgates a politics that will, in the end, not actually address any issues of employment, economic redistribution, industrial and post-industrial employment policy. They will only look at cosmetic etiquette notions of sociality that actually individualizes, isolates, and makes us all separated and highly offendable people. So that's my response to that. I know some of you wanted to see me and Gabe have, celebrity death match or something like that, but we're not going to do it. We disagree on some major points. Like he mentioned race as a part of difference. I will say class contradiction trumps race. We disagree on that. That's fine. We're not going to, tussle here. It's not going to be a shouting match like Fox News.
I was thinking of Jerry Springer, but
Oh yeah, throw down. No, we're
can't
both
really do that because
way.
it's not live.
No, we're both way too professionalized and well behaved to do that. So
Okay. Well, I will bring in Gabe though, and then I'll bring in Pete for a few minutes, and then we'll have another round of questions.
Sure. So let me maybe try to answer the questions in the order they were asked, and then kind of respond a bit to what Catherine just said. So David asked, is the current PMC the proper designation? Are there multiple middling strata? And I think this is a kind of important question, but a challenging one, because in fact, the working class, of course, also is differentiated. All classes are differentiated internally and stratified and fractionalized in various ways. And it seems to me, and I appreciated the kind of empirical operationalization of that Peter did of this concept, but it seems to me that this is a real conceptual and empirical challenge with class analysis, because the idea of proximity, which strata of society are proximate to one another in terms of income, in terms of attitude, and so on, that's useful. But I think I think there are real limits to that in terms of our ability to describe something like a class, which here I will say I am a Thomsonian on this point. I do think that classes are fluid and relational historical processes, which at times bring together people who on various empirical measure would appear to be closer to people who we would identify as being in another class. And I think that's always true of all processes of class formation and deformation. Because classes are formed, as Adam Przeworski says, through a political process that doesn't correspond directly to any kind of necessary objective underlying material phenomena, right? They're not independent of objective economic forces and relations of production by any stretch, right? But they also can't, they don't arise directly from them. Rather, there's a kind of political mediation, which can, in its results, produce quite heteroclite class formations. And so in that sense, it's not clear to me it's not going to be exactly what the kind of intellectual cash value is of demonstrating certain forms of proximity in terms of identifying boundaries of classes. And that's something I think would be useful to talk about more, because it seems to me that a lot of this conversation ultimately turns on this question of what I've described as the kind of lower strata of the PMC. Now, maybe we just want to say, look, these are actually just the working class, right? Nurses, teachers, graduate students, this is just the working class. And, I think that's fine to a degree. I think in important ways, they are of the working class. But I do think then it leads to make that assignment deprives us of some intellectual tools and procedures for trying to understand, well, why is it there's militancy arising here and not there, right? Why is it that some of these strata are participating in increasing ways in socialist politics and trade union activity, whatever, and others not? And so for me, the idea that there is or was something that with some coherency in the middle, coherency articulated particularly at the level of the political, which is losing its, or which is decohering over time and setting loose these lower strata, is quite useful in from that methodological perspective. I guess to the other questions, isn't the ruling class kind of able to recruit new collaborators? Certainly, but it that continues to suffer from all of the kind of contradictions that I was talking about. So on the one hand, yes, right, there is this kind of effort involving the Black urban middle class, and various kinds of liberal and neoliberal education reform is the example given to privatize school systems. At the same time, right, that produced the most significant moment of teachers union militancy, I think probably in US history, which we're still in some ways. Where I live in Chicago, it's looking fairly possible that a product of that militancy is going to become the mayor. We don't know yet, the election isn't a week, but there have been an incredible wave of teachers union strikes dealing real setbacks to that agenda. And I think that, while I've learned a lot from the ideas of someone like Adolph Reed, I do think that there, and I'll say this about Catherine's analysis too. I think that I don't understand the impulse, I suppose, to deny the kind of contradictory dynamism of the processes that we're talking about, and to refuse to acknowledge that although they are limited and they are contradictory, there are sort of working class formation moments and processes that result, that generate real political possibility. And then I guess that leads to the final point, which is how we use the PMC concept in our own organizing. I mean, you know, I've just been in, you know, thousands of conversations over the years with not just graduate students, but custodial workers and dining hall workers and hotel workers, and neighbors who I'm asking to vote for a candidate in a local election, or, you know, talking to about their debt to the local hospital, a million different things, where in one way or another, right, you have to have something you can say about why I'm here. Why is this, like, you know, visibly middle-class professional white kid at my door asking me for something? Is this someone who I have anything in common with? That's a question anyone wants to have an answer to when they're being asked to participate in something political. Now, I don't talk about the PMC in that conversation, right? But I talk about, well, let me give you an example. I ran a city council campaign for a custodian in New Haven while I was in graduate school, who was a union member, you know, was involved in local politics. Through my union, I was recruited to run his campaign, and largely working class Black neighborhood. And, you know, every time someone opened a door, right, that question was on their face. What does this fucking Yale kid want from me? You know, I found that actually the most effective strategy was not to appeal to, well, you and I are both working class and therefore have the same interest, although that's true in some way, right? The most effective strategy was to try to give an account of what led me to their door, right? What is it about my experience as a graduate student, someone who, you know, is finding that my own economic prospects are maybe not what I had hoped, the ways I'm exploited, that led me to get involved in my union. My union is involved in your election. And surely you too have some experience of not the exact same processes and forces, but something that you can meaningfully compare to what I'm describing. And, you know, that is the use of this concept. So I'll stop there. I don't want to talk too long, thanks.
Thanks very much, Gabe. Shout out to anyone who was involved in the UCU lecturer strike in the UK, of course. Although arguably the PMC values of the leadership may have had some role in the defeat of this strike, as it appears to be at the minute. Anyway, I will bring in Pete.
I'll be really quick, a couple of quick points. I mean, first, in response to Gabe, you're absolutely right that this form of statistical analysis is limited. Inevitably, you know, data is collected at a certain time point. It just provides a snapshot in time. I would say, though, that every approach is limited in its own way. Every method is limited, and each one allows us to view things in a slightly different way. And I think that this is a useful and an interesting one. And partly building off of David's comment about, you know, the multiplicities of middle strata. I mean, it's absolutely correct. I suppose the question is, how do we think about that? And I think that within the PMC, corporate I think that the distinction that Wright makes between expert managers and experts is an interesting one, because experts, what we're really talking about here is, like, you know, university professors, lawyers, and that sort of thing. Expert managers are far closer to what you might think of as corporate executives. And while both of them are part of the professional managerial class, and at certain times will have very correlated interests, at other times they won't. At other times there might be a divergence between them because of the, I think, you know, Wright provides a very, you know, profound way of thinking about it in terms of the mechanisms which are used within the class structure to capture part of the social surplus that's created. I think that's a useful way for thinking about it. And I think because of the differences between those groups, that's a useful way for thinking about differences within the PMC, and potentially could allow us to explain why there will be splits and divisions within the PMC at certain times. And then finally, on the question of organizing, one quick reflection. I, along with James and others on this call, were involved in organizing the Radical Independence campaign in Scotland, which was a left-wing campaign for Scottish independence. And when we first launched the campaign, as is the case everywhere, the left was in a pretty weak position. And so naturally, the response to that is we need maximum unity. We need to build the broadest left coalition possible. And it was very successful. But the actual practical operation of that is, for example, we launched it with a big conference. And who do you invite to speak at the conference? You invite the sort of celebrity left, the left journalists that are well known, some lefty academics, and so on and so on. And what ends up happening is that you effectively just platform left civil society. And what we saw, it was a very successful campaign for a while. But when the referendum ended, the centrist forces were able to capture all of the spirit of radicalism of that movement. And in hindsight, and in reflection, and of course things are easier in hindsight, I think that what we didn't have was, at the time, was an analysis of the professional managerial class and the way those dynamics might play out. Because at the end of the day, in any campaign, what we're trying to do is strengthen the combativity and organization of working class forces. And in some ways we did that in that campaign, but by not recognizing the dynamic of the way in which the PMC operated within that campaign and the broader movement as well, we weren't actually necessarily able to capitalize on that in the way that we potentially could have.
Thanks very much, Pete. Small abuse of my chair's prerogative. I'm going to ask a question, particularly aimed at Gabe, but any others are welcome to come in on this as well. Because you spoke about how the PMC can become a site of struggle and contestation, and so on. Now, I'm wondering, would you acknowledge that that kind of works in both ways and can become as much of a problem in some cases as anything else? Because my impression of it is certainly that you have seen a process by which the lower elements of the PMC are pushed down nearer to the working class, which can have impacts in terms of combativity on strikes, etc., right? But is it not also the case that they tend to, in the process, and this is a project we're quite familiar with in history from the 20s and 30s as well, there's a process of trying to do at the same time cultural and political differentiation from the mass of the working class for fear precisely of being pushed and squeezed down. And my worry about this, I suppose, is quite similar to Pete's, which is that in the process of that, what comes to stand for the left essentially is the values of precisely that layer that is squeezed down. And because it's so terrified of being squeezed, it therefore pursues a project of saying, we are not like those scum out there, like those basket of deplorables type of thing. We're a very different type of people, more elevated. In some ways, a kind of class aspect of politics that some of us might have been familiar with from Pierre Bourdieu and others in terms of distinction back in the day. Is there something like that going on? And if so, does that become a problem for the left, even if they're superficially radical and even superficially likely to take trade union action? So that's my question. I'm going to bring in some questions from the chat. Firstly, a question from James, another James. Is the notion of the PMC a departure from older frameworks for analysis? If I can't read that properly, sorry. Erik Olin Wright's contradictory class locations, Alvin Goldner's new class, or is it just a restatement of some of these older themes? Second, if we assume that the PMC exists, is it, to put it in Marxist terms, only a class in itself, or is it a class for itself? I believe when the Ehrenreichs started writing about this in the 80s, did they not come to the view that it could be a sort of new universal class for a while to replace that of the working class, or did I misinterpret that? Anyways, that's an interesting question. Right. Aren't all workers literally tasked with the reproduction of capital by definition? How can we differentiate within the class on that basis? That is a further question from Malcolm Harris. So I will take the, I'll bring in Gabe first, and then I'll bring in Pete and Catherine.
Sorry, thanks. I was just taking notes on the questions. So yes, I'll just take them in order. I certainly think that there is a risk of what you say of distinction work among the downwardly mobile PMC, differentiating itself from the working class under the economic pressures that it's under. That's really what Ehrenreich's wonderful book, Fear of Falling, is all about, right? And it's right in the title. But I suppose I would say that it seems like an error to me to imagine a kind of essential core of the class who that is organized or as an ideological essential core, that distinction impulse masked by a kind of superficial veneer of radicalism. I think that kind of logic of a kind of, inner truth and outer reality, outer reality and inner truth, I think mistakes the kind of dynamic of the contradiction that defines the PMC. Because from my perspective, all people in class society, and in one form or another, have contradictions at structure, our political, and sort of social affiliational choices in different ways, right? Working class people also have contradictions that they have to navigate. Does it make sense for me to risk my job in order to engage in a kind of form of solidarity with the workers around me, or am I better served by being close to my manager and giving him what he wants in some way, right? That is a structural contradiction that arises from labor market competition, and is not actually of a radically different nature from that which arises for downwardly mobile members of the PMC. It's sort of different in degree and not kind. And from that perspective, the kinds of contradictions about, well, what makes sense for me? Who do I want to be kind of drawn near to? Who do I want to stay away from? Are fundamentally characteristic of the class formation process in all forms. And what makes sense, rather than to try to kind of diagnose what's real and what's fake, and get into a kind of logic of forms of false consciousness, is to try to identify what is generative of the forms of unity and solidarity in a class formation process that we might wish to see, and what is not generative of it. And then how can we generate political practices and organizations that help to sustain and expand the kind of generative side of that contradiction. So, for example, I would really strongly disagree with Catherine about the idea that DSA, for example, is pervaded by a PMC ethos that makes it politically worthless. I think if we're going to say that, we have to say the same about Sanders himself, and about, in fact, a huge range of political and social struggles over the last decade. I think it's more useful to say, okay, there are things that worked here and things that didn't work here. We lost in the end, but we've gained other things. We've gained ground on other dimensions. And we have created a moment where, in particular, younger generations are favorably disposed to socialism and are favorably disposed to forms of trade union action and so on. How can we then continue to develop that contradiction? Which goes, I guess, to the other questions about class in itself and for itself, which would be just a kind of, Hegelian Marxism that I think is not actually a useful one, because all class, as I said a moment ago, all classes are always fractionalized, right? And are always kind of recomposing and decomposing themselves at all times. The concept of the PMC is dependent on, fundamentally, conceptually, in the 1970s, on Harry Braverman and his book, Labor and Monopoly Capital, which says this very early on, right? That when you actually want to look at a class, if you look closely, what you're going to see is something fluid rather than something solid, because classes are always being decomposed through the kind of transformations of the labor process. And, the Ehrenreich certainly would not have said the PMC is a universal class. And I don't know if they would have even used the language of universal class for anyone, not being that kind of Marxists exactly. I think rather what they thought is that it occupies a strategically useful site of contestation, which brings me to Malcolm's question, the last question: aren't all workers engaged in the reproduction of capital? Which certainly seems true to me, and which is why I would go to kind of questions of labor process as opposed to questions of value relation, right? And to say that it's the labor processes of the PMC that potentially implicate it in complex ways in both social control and that do implicate it in social control, and also generate possibilities of resistance and realignment as a class, because it's labor process that is under pressure from the capitalist class in terms of how social control is carried out. For example, if you think about a teacher or a nurse, I realize these are controversial examples in this analysis, but if you think about a teacher or a nurse, the kinds of labor processes that they're engaged in are under pressure in terms of how many students or how many patients are they responsible for. And capital both wants them to do more all the time. Okay, I have to stop. I'm sorry. I'll just cut off there.
Gabe, I just want to try and make sure we've got maximum time for people to ask questions and comment. But thanks very much. I'm going to bring in Pete. Pete, if you could try to keep it to roughly about 2 minutes, just so we've got time for a final round of questions.
Sure thing. So on the last two questions, first in relation to the distinction between the Ehrenreich's approach and other forms of class analysis, I wouldn't say that it's a departure, nor is it a restatement. It's distinctive in its own right, but these ideas were being developed in many respects all at the same time in terms of Wright's working contradictory class locations was happening at the same time that the Ehrenreichs were producing this thesis. What's distinctive about the Ehrenreich's approach is that they define the PMC in functional terms, that is, in relation to the reproduction of capitalism. And at first glance, the functional discussion of classes seems like a useful way of grappling with the relationship with managers, professionals, and other such positions to the working class, because many of these positions are not immediately engaged in production, and much of their activity can be seen as having the effect of reproducing class relations, that is, serving the function of reproduction. The problem, though, is that functional effects are rarely completely coincident with structural positions. And this general problem is particularly striking in the distinction between the functions of production and reproduction. To come on to Malcolm's question, you're absolutely right. As Marx's classic analysis of commodity fetishism sort of shows, a great deal of the burden of reproducing class relations takes place directly within the labor process itself. You know, industrial workers perform the function of reproduction simply by engaging in the capitalist production process. I think, though, what the Ehrenreichs are doing, though, is that they're not concerned so much with reproduction in general as they are with the specialized performance of reproductive activities. So while factory workers might contribute to the reproduction of class relations, the work isn't specialized in the function of reproduction. And I think that's what the Ehrenreichs are trying to get at.
Thanks, Pete. Very good, very concise. I'm going to bring in Catherine. Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, so I think Gabe and Pete did a good job of responding to most of the questions. And the one thing that I wanted to say was that in my knocking on doors and organizing from personal experience, I think that the thing that I was confronted with most deeply was that the more working class someone was, the more resistant they were to politics in general. There was a general sense of it doesn't make any difference to me who wins. And what is in the end like the falseness of that? That part of maybe our optimism with regard to our own class formations, our cosmopolitanism, our optimism about knowledge, understanding, nuance, etc., is that we hope that we'll arrive at some kind of argument that will break capitalism apart. And when I was talking with working class people in 2020, especially, I realized that they were absolutely right. Their analysis of the political situation was completely astute. No matter what I could have stood on my head for Bernie, but what they were saying was, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter who wins. They don't care about us. And this kind of resistance to politics, I would say, like opacity in general, is something that we all have to confront. And I think dialectically, it is related to the ways in which liberalism has proliferated with regard to a false language of progressivism. And one of the things I wanted to say, and everyone explained very well, like I think what the PMC does with regard to reproducing the ideological conditions of the capitalist mode of production. But one of the things I think was most salient in, first Capital Volume 1 was that Marx says all of the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production are contained within the working day. The boss wants to work you to death. You want some time for yourself so that you can reproduce yourself in a different way. I mean, I'm simplifying, but that's kind of what it is. The professional managerial class in the 20th century and 21st century is a class that looks at the working day as like continuously invaded through the use of personal computing and smartphones and data surveillance, that there is no differentiation any longer. You are passionate, you follow your bliss, you work all the time, and you imagine that there is this mode of non-alienated being where, and it's sort of provided where all of our entertainment, all my emails are all on here, and I'm being surveilled by Meta and Alphabet while I'm entertaining myself and working at the same time. So to return to this idea of like the industrial capitalism's mode of production provided Marx with an idea of what alienation was, what exploitation was. And I think that this is something we need to go back to and understand with regard to also the opacity of politics, electoral or ideological, with regard to the working class, because the working class in America feels completely abandoned. Now, whether or not you want to say that the graduate students, nurses, and teachers are part of that working class, the industrial working class or the non-college educated working class, the decimated center of this country really feels this kind of abandonment by the political class, by the credentialed elites, by what we talked about as the cosmopolitan PMC. And that is the thing that it's the obdurate reality of all of this hyperactivity that Ehrenreich's actually right about with regard to the liberal domination of progressive politics after 1968.
Thanks, Catherine. We have Steve with his hand up. If anyone wants to speak in this final round, I will otherwise take some questions from the chat, but if you would like to speak, please put up your hand now. Otherwise, I will bring in Steve, please.
Thanks very much for this discussion. It's been great. Yeah, my question is to the speakers more about what the operational conclusions are in terms of how we build to fight back. It seems to me that large elements of what has been called the PMC are actually part of the working class. And therefore, the labor market is such that the gains of nurses, teachers, et cetera, reflect positively on blue collar workers, other workers, and so forth. Therefore, you know, the old saying of injury to one is an injury to all is absolutely correct. And part of what we need to do is build solidarity across the different sections of the working class. That means higher paid workers supporting lower paid workers, but it also means lower paid workers supporting higher paid workers. It also means that we need to fight for solidarity across racial lines. That is, win white workers to fight against racism against Black people, men, women, et cetera, all those kind of things. And that needs to be, we need to fight against the capitalist ideology in all classes, whether the so-called PMC or the working class or whatever. So anyway, I think that's the approach I think we should take. Just wondering what the speakers think about that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Steve. Justin, would you prefer I just read your question or would you rather speak? I'll take that as read my question, please. Right, okay. Right. Justin's question is, given Gramsci's characterization of civil society as fundamentally intertwined with political society and economic power, if PMC constitute the labour force of civil society, how can the left be expected to build power without power within each pillar of the state? Pardon me. Okay, that's one question. Does anyone want the final question, or will I have one from the chat? Okay, I'll go two more from the chat, right? One I will take because it's specifically to Pete. Is part of the problem with Scottish independence the fact that it is not a left-wing college per se, and thus easier to colonise by centrist liberals than something that might have started out from a foundation as more class-based? I guess that might apply to like left populist kind of movements more generally as well. So that's an interesting question to pursue. I also had one from Rishi, which I'm trying to find because there's a lot of questions. So just bear with me for a wee sec. What besides complex class position proximity shape PMC politics? What is the political sociology of the PMC? Okay, I'm going to take speakers in their original order, and you can also use this as your summing up if you like. So you've got roughly 3 to 4 minutes to conclude. So also feel free to come back on points made by other speakers and so on. Catherine, I'll take you first.
Okay, so I'll try to take the question of political sociology because I forgot the first two questions. But the idea for me of looking at how industrial capitalism as a mode of production moves into post-industrial capitalism since 1970s is really critical, because to oversee the transformation of an industrial economy into a post-industrial economy, you need a larger and larger group of experts, expert managers. This is what Peter's differentiation, according to the Erik Olin Wright schema, works so well with. But this kind of clerkdom, and I always look at this kind of historically, is when you think of the family firm in the 19th century, the capitalists owned the means of production, and the clerk was basically like a family employee, was a semi-feudal relationship. But that level of clerkdom, managerialism, if you like, has now been supplemented by consultants, and has now, in the neoliberal age, been supplemented by a whole phalanx of people who are able to take the concerns of the private corporation and meld them to suck public monies out of different public programs. This is what's happened with the Inflation Reduction Act. This is what's happened with this COVID support, is that the complexification of corporate capitalism as a mode of deindustrialization, in the mode of financialization, and finally in the mode of neoliberal speculation and private partnerships, because these guys are not geniuses in profit making anymore. The declining rate of profit is real. They are just now using public monies to leverage their own bottom lines. What I didn't get into in my talk was about how Richard Blum, while he was a UC regent, was investing in for-profit universities and colleges known as diploma mills, which indebted working class students, crushed them with student loan debt, but also pulled Pell Grant money that was money given by the American government to working class students so that they could go to college. They pulled that money from the public treasury into their own pockets. Richard Blum enriched himself by being an investor in these most exploitative post-industrial institutions, and was also advising the UC at the same time. I don't know if this is a political sociology of this whole thing, but you can see how credentialism, expertise in finance capital is necessary. So I'm talking about the high layer of this class. With regard to redistribution, I think focusing on economic redistribution, breaking the back of this kind of private profiteering from public programs, this is what we need to do. This is what every union needs to be aware of. The unions were the first to oppose UC investment in Blackstone's BREIT. And so I don't know if that's an answer to the question of the political sociology of the term, but I'll just finish up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I will bring in Gabe and then Pete.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to answer the question about Scotland, obviously, but on the other two, I think they go nicely together, because it seems to me that, I mean, this is what my book is about, which is not really about the PMC, but it's about, or directly, but it rather is about the topic Catherine is alluding to, the kind of transition from an industrial to a post-industrial or deindustrialized economy, and the forms of social processes that sets in motion. I'm not going to go into my book, but I just want to say that there are the sites of PMC class formation, or what I've been describing as PMC, the disintegration of the PMC and its formation into more militant, working class aligned organizations and practices, are sites, as Catherine is saying, that are dependent on or even part of the state to a significant degree, right? These kind of civil society institutions, universities, hospitals, school systems, a variety of nonprofits that exist for the purpose of capitalist social reproduction. And yet, because they depend upon labor of different kinds, and have to bring economic pressures to bear on that labor, also generate class antagonism and potentially class formation. And so in that sense, I don't think that there's as much a political sociology here as a political history, in which the role of the PMC or of the kind of workers of the PMC, the lower half of the PMC, as the successful bearers of the process of capitalist reproduction, has over time begun to break down, and their political alignment with the kind of larger class alignment with neoliberalism has begun to weaken, thus giving us PMC socialism in its varieties. Now, just to reiterate and conclude, the ability of that process to cross over into a kind of wider working class movement, I think that the jury remains out on that. Although, as you can tell, I'm relatively more optimistic about that possibility. And I think it's the opening of that possibility that we see in the fact that these are often described as socialist movements and trade union movements rather than some kind of guild movement.
That was brilliant, Gabe. Thank you. Although disappointed not to hear your thoughts on Scotland. The long and the short of it is that our PMC-dominated governing class is having a collective meltdown. Anyway, I will bring in Pete for final word.
Yeah, I mean, Scottish politics isn't always interesting, but if you're not familiar with it, now's the time to tune in because they really are eating themselves alive at the moment. On the question on Scotland, yeah, I think that the point is very well made. It quite possibly was a lot easier to co-opt the Scottish independence movement because it's not necessarily a left-right issue, although I would say that being from Scotland, it's not often that we get to contribute to the global left, and breaking up the old colonial British state would be one thing that I do hope that one day Scotland's able to contribute. That would be an act of genuine internationalism. But apart from that, I'm not going to answer any of your questions, but I am going to make a pitch to you all, which is this. Building institutions of the left is incredibly important. And I want to thank you all for coming, but I also want to encourage you to go to the Havens Wright Centre website, havenswright.whisky.edu, and check out our upcoming events. In particular, we have another Contour Havens co-organised event on the politics of the working class with Kat Boyd from Contour, Vivek Chibber, and Daniel Chavez from the TNI. And I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. So please come to that. And please go to the Contour website. It's contour.scot. In both cases, if you're not already, please sign up for the mailing list. This stuff helps us, and all of you can play a role in that. So please share our events, share our stuff on social media. Last week's discussion on who are the ruling class, the YouTube video of that will be out later today. Go to the Havens Wright YouTube channel, check that out, share it, and please do your bit to help us build left institutions that can fight back. Thank you.
Here. Many thanks, Pete. I would absolutely echo that. Particularly if you're one of those people like myself who's always moaning about the professional managerial class. All the more important that you also turn up for the debate about what is the working class today. Doubly important that you turn up for that. Okay, brilliant. I think that's all we have time for.
I will.
One more point.
Thank you very much, James. Yes, I do want to say on behalf of the Havens Wright Center and Contour Magazine, I'd really like to extend my thanks again to Catherine Liu, Gabe Winant, and Peter Ramand, as well as to James Foley for his moderating skills today, and to you, the audience. The final event of the series, as Pete has already announced, but I'll share it one more time. The Strategic Dilemmas of Working Class Politics and Organization Today will be held on April 13th at 11 a.m. U.S. Central, 5 p.m. UK time. However, if you like what we do here at the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice, you don't have to wait that long for additional programming. You can come to some visiting scholars events that are actually taking place next week. We are going to have Thea Rio Francos visit us on Wednesday, March 1st for her discussion of Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism. And the following day, on March 2nd, we will have Stein Ringen visit and deliver his lecture, How Democracies Live. For more information on those and other events that we have in store for you, please visit our website. And with that, I bid you adieu. Have a lovely evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.